Marin had not climbed to the moon court to be chosen. She had come to light the right fires and slip away before anyone remembered she existed, the way she had on every full moon since she was old enough to carry a taper without burning her sleeve. So when the silver light bent toward her, she was certain it had made a mistake. The choosing happened once a year, on the high terrace of Stony Reek, under a moon swollen fat and white over the peaks. This was the night the Alpha King would name his Luna. The whole of the Caldermoon pack had crowded the terrace to watch it, hundreds of them packed, shoulder to shoulder, their breath fogging in the cold, their eyes fixed on the circle of 9 noble daughters who stood waiting in the center in gowns the color of frost. Marin was not in the circle. Marin was at the edge, kneeling over the last bowl of moon oil, coaxing a stubborn wick to catch. She heard the old rite begin. She heard Orla's cracked voice rise over the crowd, calling on the moon to mark the one the king's blood already knew. And then the light came down. It did not go to the circle. It poured past the 9 noble daughters, like water finding the lowest ground, and it found Marin on her knees, in the dark, at the terrace's rim, and it wrapped around her like it had been looking for her all along. The terrace went silent. Hundreds of wolves, silent at once, is a sound of its own. Marin felt it press against her skin. She looked up, and the light was on her hands, in her hair, soaking through her plain gray dress, and every face on that terrace had turned to stare at her. She did not understand. She wanted to say there had been an error, that she was only the shrine girl, that she lit the fires and swept the ash and no one had ever once looked at her like this. Then her gaze found the dais, and the king was already looking back. Dryston, Alpha King of Dralmor, was a tall and brutal shape against the moon. She had seen him before, only at a distance, the way the whole pack saw him, on a balcony or at the head of a column of riders. Up close, even across the width of the terrace, the force of him reached her like heat off a forge. The bond struck a heartbeat later, a hook behind her ribs pulling toward him, sudden and absolute, and she watched the same recognition tear across his face. The moon had named them, fated. His and hers sealed in old light in front of the entire pack. For one suspended moment, she felt the most foolish thing she had ever felt. She felt hope. No, he said it quietly, but the terrace carried it to every ear. Marin flinched. I reject this. Dryston's voice did not rise. It did not need to. The moon is mistaken, or the right is. I will not take a foundling off the shrine steps. As Luna of this pack. His gray eyes were fixed on her, and there was nothing soft in them, nothing at all. Put out your fires, girl, and go down. Forget this happened. I already have. The cruelty of it was so clean and so total, that for a moment, Marin felt nothing. Then the heat rushed up her neck and into her face, and she understood that she had just been refused in front of every soul she had ever known, and that they had all watched the moon choose her, and watched their king throw her back like a fish, too small to keep. Somewhere in the circle of noble daughters, Vesna of House Aldermere smiled. Marin saw it. The most beautiful woman on the terrace, the one the pack had wanted him to choose for 2 long years, and she smiled like a door had just opened in front of her. Marin got to her feet, her legs barely held. She had been raised on the lesson that the smallest creature survives by not being seen, and every part of her wanted only to vanish down the shrine stair into the dark and never climb it again. She had come up here at dusk with a basket of oil and a striker, sent by Orla to tend the fires as she had 100 times, expecting nothing, wanting nothing, planning to be home in her cot before the dancing started. She turned to flee to get off that terrace before the first tear fell, and she had taken exactly 2 steps when Orla's voice cracked across the night like a whip. You cannot. The old right mistress came forward through the parting crowd, bent and small and ancient, her moon staff tapping the stone. She was not looking at Marin. She was looking at the king. You cannot reject her, Dryston, son of Calder, Orla said, and using his blood name in front of the pack made even the alpha go still. The moon does not offer. The moon decides. And our ancestors, knowing that one day a proud alpha might try to refuse what the moon set before him, bound a law into this very stone. Her staff struck the terrace, and the seam of silver light at Marin's feet flared and ran across the floor like spilled mercury, splitting, racing toward the dais. By the moon law of the waning year, Orla called, a fated mate refused is not a mate cast off. The law binds the rejected pair as husband and wife for one full turning of the year, that no alpha may deny the moon on the strength of his pride alone, neither may part from the other, neither may take another to bed or bond. And when the year is spent, the moon will judge what you have made of it. The light reached Dryston and climbed him like a vine, and Marin felt an answering warmth close around her own left wrist, a band of pale fire that cooled into a thin silver mark on her skin. She gasped. Across the terrace, on the king's wrist, the same mark burned and faded to silver, bound. She looked up at him expecting fury. She had braced for fury. What she saw instead stopped the breath in her throat. Dryston was staring at the mark on his wrist, and his face had gone the color of ash, and the thing in his eyes was not anger at all, it was fear. The most dangerous wolf in the realm was looking at a nameless shrine girl as though the moon had just chained him to a blade and pressed it against his own heart. He lifted his gaze to her one more time. And what he said, low enough that perhaps only she heard it under the rising roar of the pack, was not a threat. "I am sorry," Dryston said, "for what this is going to cost you." Then the guards closed around him and swept him from the terrace, and the noble houses surged and muttered, and the 9 daughters of the circle melted away into the crowd with their frost gowns and their ruined hopes. No one came to Marin. No one would meet her eyes. She stood alone in a fading ring of silver with a king's mark cooling on her wrist while the pack she had served her whole life drew back from her as though her bad luck might be catching. Only Orla remained, a small bent shape leaning on her staff, and the look the old woman gave her was not triumph and was not pity, it was something closer to grief. "Go down, child," Orla said softly. "The fires can burn themselves out tonight." But there was no down to go to, not anymore. 365 nights stretched out in front of Marin, like a road into the dark, and at the far end of it stood a husband who had wept no tears, yet had looked at her like a sentence. And somewhere out past the torchlight, a great many people had just decided exactly what they thought of her. They gave her a room she did not want, and a title no one would say to her face. Halvard, the king's beta, came for her before dawn. He was a broad, quiet man, with a soldier's stillness, and he did not look at her with contempt, which by then felt like a kindness so large she nearly wept at it. He led her up through the keep, past the levels where servants lived, past the levels where lords lived, all the way to a wide carved door beside the king's own chambers. The room beyond it was finer than any she had ever stood in, warm-stoned and high-ceilinged, with a bed she could have fit her whole shrine cot inside 3 times over, and a window that looked out across the sleeping valley. "This was the Queen Mother's chamber," Halvard said. "It has stood empty since the old king's death. The king ordered it opened and aired for you yesterday, and ordered the south stairs sealed, so that no one reaches this floor without passing the door guard. He let that sit a moment. Do not mistake me. He did not do it out of fondness. He did it because a dead wife inside the first month would raise questions he cannot afford. But he did do it. Remember that, on the nights you decide he is only cruel." Marin turned slowly in the middle of the room, this stranger's room, this dead woman's room, that was now, somehow, hers. "I do not want it," she said. "I want my cot and my striker and my crow. I want yesterday morning back." "I know," Halvard said, and the simple weight of it undid her more than any comfort could have. He gestured her to a chair and sat across from her forearms, on his knees, and his face was grave. You did not read the law before it bound you. Few do, so hear it now, from someone who has, because it will save your life to understand it. The moon law does not only join your hands, Marin, it weaves your lives. Soon, and for the two of you, perhaps sooner than the law has stirred in living memory, you will begin to feel him under your own skin. If he sickens, you will sicken. If you are cut, he will feel the ghost of the wound. And should either of you die before the year is spent, the law does not simply release the other. He paused. It follows them down. The survivor does not outlast the loss by more than a few days. The bond will not be left half alive. The cold came into Marin slowly, starting in her hands. So I am tied to a man who hates me, she said. And if he dies, I die. And if you die, he dies, Halvard said. Which is the only reason some in this keep have not already arranged it. They are weighing whether his life is worth your death. I would not give them long to decide. He rose. Stay on this floor. Eat what is brought to you. Trust no smiling face. And do not, whatever the bond tells you, go looking for him. He has asked that you keep apart, and for now, it is wiser to let him have that. For 4 days, she obeyed. For 4 days she saw nothing of her husband but the back of him. He left rooms when she entered them. He took his meals where she was not. On the second morning, she tried to go down to the shrine, to do the one thing in the world she knew how to do, and a steward stopped her on the stair with a bow so deep it was an insult and informed her that the Luna of Caldermoon did not sweep ash. She went back up. She built a small shrine of her own in the corner of her grand empty room, out of a candle stub and a bowl of clean water, because old habits do not die, just because your whole life has. And she knelt there each evening and asked the moon, with no great hope, what it could possibly have been thinking. On the 3rd day, they presented her to the court. It was not a kindness, and it was not a welcome. It was, Halvard told her flatly, while a silent woman pinned her into a borrowed gown, a necessity. A Luna, who was never seen, would breed even worse rumors than a Luna who was despised. And so she would stand at the foot of the dais, for the length of one audience, and she would be looked at, and then it would be over. She stood where she was placed. She kept her chin level the way Orla had taught her to do at funerals. And she endured it. The great hall was full, and every face in it had an opinion. She felt their eyes crawl over her plain hands, and her unfamiliar gown, and her shrine girl's stillness, and she heard the whispers travel the room in a slow tide. Foundling and shame of the moon. And how long do you suppose? On his high seat Dresden looked at the petitioners, at the windows, at the floor, at everything in the hall except the wife standing below him, and his refusal to glance her way only fed the whispers louder. Near the front, among the great houses, Vesna of Aldermere watched Marin with a small, contented smile, and murmured something behind her hand to the lords around her, and they laughed, soft and ugly, and did not trouble to hide it. Only Halvard's hand, resting briefly and steadily at her shoulder as he guided her out, kept her upright to the door. Now they have seen you, he said low, and now you may stop being looked at for a while. You did well. You did not give them the tears they came for. It was not much, but it was the kindest thing anyone in that keep had said to her, and she held on to it. Once, crossing a gallery at dusk, she came around a pillar and found him there, close enough to touch. Dresden went rigid as a struck animal. For half a breath they simply stared at one another, husband and wife, strangers, and she saw his throat work and his hand half rise, as though some part of him meant to reach for her before the rest of him remembered itself. Then he turned on his heel and was gone, his boots ringing on the stone, and Marin was left where she was, with her heart going far too fast, telling herself firmly that she was glad. On the 5th night, the bond began to do what Halvard had warned her. It would. It started as an ache behind her breastbone, dull and strange, like hunger in a place that could not be fed. By midnight, it had sharpened into a pulling, low and insistent, dragging her attention again and again toward the wall her chamber shared with his. She pressed her palm, flat to the cold stone and felt, faintly leaking through her own skin, a fever that was not hers, a heart racing that was not her heart. And underneath both, a wrongness vast and lightless and old, seeping through the wall from the far side like cold water through a crack. He was suffering. She did not know how she knew it. She knew it the way she knew her own name. She fought it for an hour. She knelt at her little shrine and pressed her hands over her ears and told herself it was not her concern, that he had thrown her away, that he had asked to be left alone, and she owed him nothing, nothing at all. Then the fever spiked so hard her own vision swam, and a sound came through the stone, low and broken, a sound she would not have believed that proud throat could make, and every promise she had made to herself dissolved at once. Marin was on her feet, and through the door, and down the dark hall, before she had decided to move. The door guard moved to block her. Halvard appeared from the shadows as though he had been waiting, and stopped the man with a single sharp gesture, and his face in the low light had gone gray. "How did you know?" Halvard said. It was not quite a question. "Through the wall," Marin whispered. The wrongness was a roar in her now this close. "What is wrong with him? Tell me the truth. What is killing my husband?" Halvard looked at her for a long moment. Whatever he saw in her face seemed to decide him. He turned and he opened the door. The king's chamber was enormous and cold, and Dristan was on the floor. He had gone down from the chair by the window, and he knelt on the bare stone, with one hand fisted against his chest, and his breath came in short, tearing pulls, and his eyes were open, but seeing nothing in the room. Sweat sheened his skin and plastered his dark hair to his brow. The great wolf of Drellmore, the warlord who had broken the Iron Reach Rebellion in a single winter, who had ended the border wars with his own hands and a reputation that did half his fighting for him, was shaking on the ground like a man freezing to death in a warm room. "It takes him at night," Halvard said quietly, behind her. "It has done for a year, since the night his father died and passed him the crown and one other thing besides. We have hidden it from the pack at the cost of nearly everything we have. Every healer in the realm has looked at him and gone away with no name for it, and strict orders never to speak of it. It comes with the dark, and it leaves him like this, and I have stopped pretending to myself that one of these nights it will not simply leave him dead." Marin crossed the room without deciding to. The bond pulled her down to her knees, in front of her husband, this man who had thrown her away in front of the world, and it would let her do only one thing, and so she did it. She took his face in both her hands. The change was immediate and total. Dristan dragged in one enormous shuddering breath, like a drowning man breaking the surface, and his gray eyes snapped into focus on her face. Under her palms the fever began, slowly, to ebb. His racing heart, which she could feel through the bond as plainly as her own pulse, stumbled and then steadied into something nearer to calm. The lightless wrongness drew back like a tide going out, and the cords of his neck loosened, and the awful tension bled out of him by degrees, until he was only a tired man, kneeling on a cold floor, breathing, alive. "You!" he rasped. His hand came up and closed around her wrist, the one that bore the silver mark, and she could not tell whether he meant to push her off or hold her there. He did neither. He simply held on his grip. Not cruel, his thumb resting over the place where her own pulse beat. "You should not be here. I told them to keep you away from this. You were dying," Marin said, and her voice shook. "I felt it through the wall. I do not think the law would have let me stay away, if I had wanted to. And I did not want to, which I am still angry about." Something flickered at the corner of his mouth. There, and gone. Then he seemed to remember who he was and who she was, and he let go of her wrist and turned his face out of her hands, and the cold came back into him like a door swinging shut. "Get her out," he said to Halvard Dristan. "Get her out." But there was no force left in it. He was emptied. Halvard did not move, and after a long moment, the king let his head drop, defeated, and knelt there, refusing to look at the single thing in the room that had eased him. Marin did not leave. She sat back on her heels, an arm's length from him, near enough that the bond stayed quiet, far enough that she was not touching him, and she stayed. He did not order her out a third time. Halvard, after watching them both, withdrew to the door and turned his back to give them what privacy a guard could give. "Why do you fight it?" Marin asked into the dark, when his breathing had slowed. "I am the only thing that helps. Anyone can see it. Why would you rather suffer than let me close?" For a long while she thought he would not answer. The fire ticked. The valley wind pressed at the windows. "Because the last person the moon promised me," Dristan said at last very low, "I lost, and I have learned what it costs the people I am told to keep." He would say no more, but he did not send her away. They passed the rest of that night like that, the two of them on the cold floor, not speaking, the candle burning low between them. Some hours before dawn his breathing finally lengthened into true sleep, the first real sleep he had likely had in days. And Marin watched the hard lines of his face go slack and thought, against every scrap of sense she owned, that he looked younger this way. Almost gentle, she did not mean to drift, but the long fear of the night caught up with her, and she slipped sideways into a doze, with her cheek against the cold stone. She woke a little to the feeling of being moved, not lifted, covered. Through the blur of half-sleep she felt a weight settle over her, warm and heavy and smelling of cedar and cold air, and she understood, with the slow logic of dreams, that the king had taken his own coat from his shoulders and laid it over hers. She felt, very lightly, the back of his hand brush a strand of hair from her face. Then he went still again, as though nothing had happened, as though if she opened her eyes, she would find him asleep and innocent of all of it. She kept her eyes closed. She let him have the lie, but something in her chest had gone warm and aching, and it did not cool for a long time. Then the room changed. It happened between one breath and the next. The candlelight thinned to silver. The cold deepened until it carried a smell, damp stone and old ash and something underneath that she had no word for. And the walls of the chamber were simply gone, and in their place stood a forest of pale trees under a moon, far too large and far too close, their bare branches reaching across a sky the color of bone. Marin was standing. She did not remember standing. The ground beneath her bare feet was soft and yielding and wrong, and the silence pressed against her ears like deep water. And through the trees, not far off, she could see her husband. Dristan stood with his back to her, motionless, staring into a bank of mist that hung between the trunks like a held breath. He did not move. He did not seem to breathe. "Dristan," she said. Her voice fell dead in the still air, swallowed before it traveled. He did not turn. But in the mist beyond him, something else did. She could not see it. She could feel it, the way you feel a gaze on the back of your neck in an empty room, and she felt it find her, and she felt it grow pleased. Slow footsteps began somewhere in the white, unhurried, deliberate, coming closer. And from within the mist, faint and layered, and terribly patient, came voices, many of them, murmuring. And though she could not catch the words, she understood their shape, because they were all saying the same thing to the man who stood frozen before them, over and over, the way the tide says the same thing to the shore. Marin's heart slammed against her ribs. She did the only thing her body would allow. She lunged forward, caught her husband's cold hand in hers and pulled. The forest tore away like wet paper. She came back into her own skin with a gasp, on her knees on the chamber floor, gray dawn light in the windows, the candle a cold puddle of wax, the king's coat sliding from her shoulders. Dristan lay where he had fallen asleep, breathing, peaceful, untouched, and her hand was wrapped tight around his, holding on exactly as it had been in that other place. She let go as though she had been burned. Her whole body shook. "What?" she whispered, to the empty room, to the sleeping king. To no one at all. What was that place? And how was I in it? She did not tell him. For 3 days she told no one, because to say it aloud would be to make it real, and she had enough that was real, to carry already. But the night settled into a shape. Each evening, when the dark came and the thing in him woke, Marin went to his chamber. She no longer waited for the bond to drag her there. She simply went, before it could begin, and she let herself in past a door guard who had stopped pretending to be surprised, and she sat in the chair by the window, while the king pretended to read reports he was not reading. When the wrongness rose in him, she would cross the room and take his hand, and it would ebb, and he would sleep. He never thanked her in words. He never once spoke of it in daylight. But the cruelty had worn away from him by degrees, night after night, like a stone smoothed by water, until what remained between them was something quieter that neither of them was brave enough to name. The small things changed first, the kind of changes a person could deny having made. The poor first chair by the window became a deeper one with a cushion. The fire was always built high before she arrived, though no servant would admit to the task. A blanket appeared folded over the arm of her chair, soft and gray and plainly costly, and when she glanced at the king, he was very intent upon his papers, and the tips of his ears had gone faintly red. A cup of spiced milk began to wait for her on the sill, still warm every night, and neither of them ever mentioned it, and she drank it every night to the last drop. So, because the silences were long, and because she had always talked too much when she was nervous, Marin began to talk. She told him about the shrine, about Orla raising her on old stories and colder porridge, about the keepers who had come before, and the small strange duties of tending the moon's house. She did not expect him to listen, and he gave no sign that he did until the evening she mentioned, in passing, the crow. There was a crow with one wing, she said, working a knot from the fringe of the blanket. It could not fly, so it lived in the offering hall, and I decided, in my wisdom, that I would teach it to ring the right bell, so that it might earn its keep and stop stealing the offering bread. She smiled at the memory, despite herself. I spent a whole winter at it. Tristan said nothing. She let the matter drop, but 3 nights later, out of a long silence, with no warning at all, he set down his pen and said, "The crow. Did it learn the bell?" Marin looked up, startled. "What the bell?" he said, still not quite looking at her, his jaw tight, as though the question cost him something to ask. "The crow with one wing. Did it ever learn to ring it?" Something turned over in her chest, painful and sweet. At once he had been listening, all those nights behind that stone face. While she filled the quiet with her chatter, he had been keeping every word. "No," she admitted. "It never learned the bell. It learned instead to take the bell rope in its beak, carry it up to the rafters, and drop it on Orla's head from a great height whenever she knelt to pray. It became remarkably skilled at that. The aim was uncanny." She sighed. Orla said it was the only truly devout creature in the whole shrine, because it never missed. And the king of Dralmor, who had not been seen to laugh in the whole long year of his reign, made a sound she had never heard from him before. It began low in his chest, rusty and disbelieving, like a hinge forced after years of stillness. He laughed, just once, and then again, helpless, his shoulders shaking with it, one hand coming up to cover his mouth as though to push it back inside. He caught himself a moment later and pressed his lips flat, but it had happened. She had heard it and seen it, and she found she was grinning at him like a fool, and for one unguarded moment he let himself look at her, really look, and the old fear had gone out of his eyes entirely, and what was left in its place was so warm and so unguarded that it frightened them both. The quiet that followed was a different kind of quiet than usual, not the careful silence of 2 strangers sharing a room, something easier, and for that very reason, more dangerous. "You are not afraid of me," Tristan said at last. He sounded honestly puzzled by it. "Everyone is afraid of me. It is the most useful thing about me. And you sit there mending my blanket fringe and telling me about a vengeful crow, as though I were a tired man and not a thing the borderlands frighten their children with." "You threw me back in front of the entire pack," Marin said. A person can only be humiliated so badly by someone before he stops being frightening and starts being merely rude. She tied off the fringe, and besides, I have held your face in my hands while you shook like a leaf and called it nothing the next morning. It is difficult to fear a man once you have seen him that small. She expected the cold to come down again. It did not. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, very low, "No, I suppose it is not." And the way he looked at her then was not a king looking at a shrine girl at all. It was just a man, worn thin, looking at the one person who had seen the worst of him and come back the next night anyway. That was the night the clue came. She had nearly drifted off in her chair when his breathing changed, deepening into the heavy sleep that the bond gave him, and then, low and broken, he spoke, not to her. To no one in the room. A name? Selah. It came out of him like something torn. His brow furrowed against the pillow, his hand fisting in the sheet. Not again. I will not let it happen again, Selah. Run. Marin went very still. She did not know the name. It was no one of the court, no one of the shrine, no name she had ever heard spoken in the keep, but the way he said it, raw and pleading and a year too late, told her everything. The last person the moon promised me, he had said, I lost. She sat in the dark, with the warm cup going cold in her hands, and understood that the foggy place, full of patient voices, and the name he wept in his sleep, and the reason a king had stood beneath the moon and called her a foundling and thrown her back, were not three mysteries at all. They were one. And she was bound for a year to the center of it. She did not have long to turn it over. The next morning, Vesna of House Aldermere was waiting for her in the gallery. She stood in a shaft of pale morning light, flanked by two of her household, beautiful and unhurried in winter blue, and she watched Marin approach with the faint, patient smile of a cat at a mouse hole. "The shrine girl," Vesna said, as though tasting something gone slightly off. "I did so want to see you properly. The rumors are such a tangle. They say the king will not touch you, will not be seen at your side, leaves any room you dare to enter. They say the great moon law has shackled our Alpha to a wife he cannot stand the sight of." She stepped closer, and her smile sharpened to something with an edge. "I came to do you a kindness, little keeper. I came to tell you not to grow comfortable. Laws written by old women can be unwritten. My house has held this throne's ear for 3 generations, and we have scholars reading the oldest rites by candlelight even now, hunting the seam in this one. And there is always a seam." Her gaze drifted down to the silver mark on Marin's wrist and lingered there, cold and assessing, the way a butcher looks at a joint. "A year is such a long time," Vesna went on softly. "So very many nights. People sicken in a year. People miss a step on a dark stair and fall. People simply walk out one evening and are never seen again, and after a decent silence, the moon grows lonely and marks someone new, someone fitting, someone who was raised to wear a crown and not to sweep ash from beneath one." She tilted her head. "I would not unpack your things. If I were you, do enjoy your borrowed crown while it lasts. They so rarely last." She swept away before Marin could find a single word, her household trailing after her like a draft from an opened tomb. And Marin remained where she stood in the long gallery, her heart pounding and the silver mark gone suddenly heavy as an iron shackle on her wrist. And she understood at last, fully and coldly, that the year stretching out ahead of her was not only a sentence to be endured, it was a target painted on her back, and the most powerful woman in the pack had just looked her in the eye and smiled and promised her she would not be allowed to live to see it end. By the turning of the second moon, the thing that lived in the dark had grown bolder, and a hand held across the space between 2 chairs was no longer enough to keep it from him. Marin felt the change before she understood it. The wrongness came earlier each night now, and it came harder, and twice she had crossed the room to take his hand, and found that the touch only slowed it instead of turning it back. On the second of those nights, Tristan had shaken for an hour with her fingers laced through his before the calm finally took him, and in the morning there had been fresh silver in his dark hair that had not been there the week before, as though the nights were spending him like coin. So, she sent for Orla. The old right mistress climbed all the way up to the king's floor, leaning on her moonstaff, and she stood over Tristan in the gray afternoon light and looked at him for a long time with her clouded eyes, and what she said when she finished was not gentle. "It is eating you," Orla said. "A little more of you every night. And the girl's hand is a cup bailing a sinking boat. You need the whole of her, Tristan, not her fingers, skin to the bond, through the dark, every hour of it. It is the only anchor strong enough to hold you in your own body until we understand what is dragging you out of it." She turned her ruined gaze on Marin. "You will sleep beside him, in contact all night. Do you understand what I am asking of you?" Marin's face went hot. "Yes," she managed. "Good," said Orla, "because the alternative is a funeral, and I am too old to bury another king." And so the last small wall between them came down. That night, Marin did not sit in the chair. She climbed into the great cold bed beside her husband, in the dark, and lay rigid as a fence post, a careful handspan from him, listening to him breathe. He was just as rigid. The bed was enormous, and still there was not enough of it, because the whole charged length of him was there in the dark beside her, the heat of him reaching across the gap, his scent of cedar and cold stone filling her every breath until she could hardly think. "You are very stiff," Tristan said into the black. "I am trying," Marin said with enormous dignity, "not to touch the king of Drellmore without his leave." A sound came out of him that might almost have been a laugh. Then the dark thing rose in him. She felt it crest through the bond, and there was no more time for dignity. She turned and put her arms around him, pressed herself the length of his back, and held on. He went taut as a drawn bow. Then, slowly, by inches, as the calm soaked into him, he eased, until his breathing deepened and his hand found hers where it lay over his heart and folded around it, and he slept. She did not sleep for a long time, but when she did, it was without dreams, and so was he, and that was the closest thing to a victory either of them had won in a year. For 3 nights, the anchor held. They lay down stiff and woke tangled, and each morning he untangled himself with the careful guilt of a man stealing warmth he had not paid for, and neither of them spoke of it. But on the 4th night, the dark thing in him did not stay turned back. She felt it gather while he slept against her, a pressure building behind her own eyes, the cold deepening until it carried that smell of damp stone and old ash, and then the bedroom was gone, and the pale trees stood close around them both. This time she had come in deeper. The mist was thinner here, and through it she could see further than ever before. And what she saw stopped her heart. Shapes stood among the trees. Not one watcher now, but many, dim and patient, ranged in a great silent crowd, their faces turned toward the single figure who knelt in the clearing with his head bowed under the weight of all those eyes. Tristan. He did not see her. He never saw her here. He knelt and bore it, the way she imagined he had borne it through every dark hour since the night his father died, and the murmuring rose around him soft and relentless, and one shape at the front, smaller than the rest, took a single step toward him out of the white. Marin ran. She crossed the wrong soft ground and seized his cold hand and wrenched, and the forest tore away, and she was back in the warm dark of the bed with her husband gasping awake beside her. Alive. Hers. She held him until the shaking passed. She did not tell him yet what she had seen, but she lay awake the rest of that night turning over the small shape that had stepped forward, and the terrible patience of it, and the certainty that it had been about to speak. She woke in his arms. Somewhere in the night he had turned, and now she was gathered against his chest, with his arm heavy across her waist and his face buried in her hair. And for a few warm and traitorous moments, before her mind woke fully, it was the most perfect thing she had ever felt. She fit against him as though the moon had cut them from one stone. Then she felt him wake, felt the precise instant he understood how he was holding her, and she braced for the cold and the bolting away. It did not come. Instead, his arm tightened. He drew her closer until there was no space left at all, and he pressed his face to the curve of her neck and breathed her in, deep and helpless and unhidden, and a low, rough sound rolled through his chest that she felt in her own. For one breathless moment, she thought he might never let go. Then he did. He drew back, not coldly this time, but carefully, the way a man sets down something he is afraid of breaking, and his gray eyes searched her face in the morning light. "There is something I have not told you," Marin said before her courage could fail, "and I am tired of carrying it alone." She told him about the pale between the forest of bone-white trees and the moon too close and the soft, wrong ground, the mist and the patient voices in it, and the thing that turned toward her and was glad. She told him she had been there twice now, that she had walked into the place that was killing him and pulled him out of it by the hand, that she had been to the heart of his curse and come home with her own 2 feet. The blood drained from his face as she spoke. By the time she finished, he was on his feet beside the bed, and he was not looking at her with disbelief. He was looking at her with horror. "You followed me there," he said, "into the between. You walked into it. I did not choose to," Marin said. "The bond took me, Dreisten. Do you not see what this means? I can reach you in there. Whatever waits for you in that fog, you have not had to face it alone since the night we wed. You simply did not know I was there. If we understood it, if Orla knew, we could fight the thing that, no." He had gone very still and very pale, and his voice came out flat and dead, the voice from the terrace, the voice that had thrown her back in front of the world. "No, you will not go there again. I cannot help going. The bond. Then we break the contact." He was already backing toward the door, toward Halvard, toward the cold, safe distance he had kept from her at the start. "You will return to your own rooms tonight, the far end of the floor. We will find another way to hold the curse. Any other way. I do not care what it costs me. It will cost you your life." Marin cried, on her feet now too. "Orla said so. You heard her. Better mine than yours." The words tore out of him, raw, and for one instant, the mask slipped and she saw the whole of what was underneath it, terror and grief, and something that looked unbearably like love before he locked it all away again. "I have stood at the edge of that place and watched it take someone I would have died for, and I swore on her grave I would never let it take another. I will not lose you to it, Marin. I would rather lose myself." "Dreisten, who was she? Who is Selah?" He flinched as though she had struck him. For a moment, she thought, finally, he would tell her. "Go to your rooms," he said instead, very quietly, and turned his face away. "It is an order. Leave." And the door of the Queen Mother's chamber closed between them, and the warmth of the bed went cold behind her. And Marin stood alone in the hall with the silver mark on her wrist, and understood that her husband had just rejected her a second time, and that this one, somehow, hurt far worse than the first. It was a week before either of them learned how badly they had miscalculated. Apart, they both began to fail. Marin felt it first as the old ache behind her breastbone, the hunger that could not be fed, except now there was no wall to cross and no hand to take, only the long empty floor between her rooms and his, and the standing order never to close it. The ache became a weight, the weight became a sickness. Her appetite went, then her sleep, then the steadiness of her own hands. She would set down a cup and watch it shiver against the wood. Her skin grew thin and gray. A cold settled into her bones that no fire could reach, and the silver mark on her wrist, which had always been faintly warm, turned chill as a band of river ice. The bond, denied the thing it had been promised, was turning on the both of them like a starved animal gnawing the hand that would not feed it, and he was worse. She did not see him, But the keep could not stop talking, and the servants no longer troubled to lower their voices when the shrine girl passed. The king had not held court in 3 days. The king had collapsed at his own council table and been carried out. The king looked 20 years older than he had under the choosing moon, and would see no one, and something was badly wrong at the heart of Stony Reach, and the great houses had begun, very quietly and very fast, to circle it like wolves who have scented a wounded elk. Halvard came to her on the 7th night, and the sight of him frightened her more than any rumor. The beta had always been a wall of a man, calm and unmoved. Now there was a hunted look in his eyes. "He is dying, Marin," he said without greeting. "I have served him since we were boys, and I have never seen him like this. He sits in the dark and shakes and says your name, and forbids me to bring you in the same breath. The fool would rather lose his own life than risk yours, and he is going to manage both." He dragged a hand down his face, and while he dies, the houses sharpen their knives. There is a petition before the Moon Court. I came to warn you before you heard it from someone who wished you ill. Vesna of Aldermere did not circle quietly. She moved. Orla brought the word, grim and breathless from the climb. The houses had petitioned the Moon Court to examine the binding for a flaw, a seam, any thread by which the marriage might be unmade and a fitting Luna installed before the year was out. Vesna had stood before the assembled lords and argued with great sorrow and greater ambition that the foundling was plainly killing the king, that anyone with eyes could see the wretched girl was a curse on his health, and that the kindest mercy for Drellmore would be to cut her loose. She had wept prettily over the ruin of so great an alpha. She had let it be known that House Aldermere would, of course, do its duty, and provide a Luna of proper blood the moment the way was clear. And she had very nearly carried the room, because a frightened pack will believe almost anything of a stranger, and there was no one of rank willing to stand and speak. For a shrine girl, no one had ever bothered to learn the name of. "She knows exactly what she is doing," Orla said grimly. "She has dressed murder up as mercy, and half the court is nodding along. If she cannot have the law unmade, child, she will simply arrange for you to die of it, and call your funeral a kindness, and be crowned by the next moon. She is not wrong that you are killing each other. She is only wrong about whose fault it is, and what the cure must be." The old woman gripped Marin's cold hands in her own, and her clouded eyes were wet. "You look like death, warmed in a cold pan. This cannot go on. You must get to him, orders or no orders, before one of them gets to you first." "He forbade me," Marin whispered. "He gave an order. The guard will not let me pass." "He is a fool, wrapped in a crown," Orla said. "And you are nearly as bad for obeying him." But there was fear under the sharpness now, real fear, and it frightened Marin more than anger could have. She tried to go to him that night. She got as far as the door, and the guard, white-faced and miserable, crossed his spear and told her the king's command stood. She went back. She lay awake in the dark with her hand pressed to her own chest, feeling the far-off labor of a heart that was not hers. And she wept, quietly, the way she had taught herself to weep at the shrine, where no one ever came to ask what was wrong. On the 9th morning, her body decided for her. She was crossing the upper gallery, on legs that had not felt entirely her own in days, when the floor tilted. It happened the way Orla had warned the curse happened to him, all at once and without mercy. The cold light from the high windows went white, then gray, then began to go out at the edges. She heard a cup of something she had been carrying shatter on the stone very far away. She heard, distant and strange, someone call her name. And then, the gray closed over her, and she was falling, and there was no one near to catch her. And the last thing she felt was a dim, surprised sorrow that she would die in a borrowed gown in a hall full of people who despised her. She did not hit the stone. Somewhere below the surface of the dark, she felt herself caught hard against a solid chest. She felt arms close around her with a desperate strength, felt a hand cradle her head, felt the frantic thunder of a heartbeat under her ear that matched, beat for ragged beat, the failing one in her own chest. And she heard a voice she would have known anywhere, stripped of every shred of its cold, breaking on her name. Marin! Marin! No! Stay! Stay with me! Look at me. You are not allowed. Do you hear me? She wanted to tell him that ordering her about was what had landed them here. She had no breath for it. She let the dark take her. She woke to the smell of dried herbs and clean linen, and the low red light of the infirmary, and to the sight of the King of Drellmore, sitting at her bedside, with his head bowed into his hands, more undone than she had ever seen a man, his great shoulders shaking. When she stirred, he looked up, and the raw relief that flooded his ruined face stole what little breath she had recovered. "You are awake," he said, and his voice was wrecked. He reached for her, then stopped himself, his hand hovering above hers, as though he had forgotten he was allowed. "I felt you fall across the whole keep. I felt your heart go, and I have never run so fast in my life, and I was still nearly too late." His jaw worked. "I did this. My order did this. I was so frightened of the thing that might take you that I never once counted the thing that surely would." "Then take my hand," Marin whispered, "before you talk us both into the grave." He did. He folded her cold fingers into his and pressed them hard against his chest, over the frantic heart, and the moment they touched, she felt the bond stop screaming. For the first time in a week, warmth crept back into her bones. The shivering eased. Across from her, she watched the gray drain out of his face by degrees, and the worst of the age fall away from him, the two of them mending each other simply by holding on. And the cruel arithmetic of it could not have been plainer if it had been carved into the wall. "I will not order you away again," Tristan said, low and fierce, his thumb moving over her knuckles as though to convince himself she was real. "Whatever comes, whatever it costs me, I am done deciding your life for you from across a hall. If the dark wants you, it will have to come through me to reach you, and a great many things have tried that and failed." He bowed his head over their joined hands. "Forgive me, I was trying to save you. I only learned how to do it by nearly killing you instead." Orla stood at the foot of the bed with her arms folded, and her voice when she spoke was quiet and final, and it landed in the room like a stone into a deep well. "Now, perhaps you will both listen," she said, "because I have read the law to its last word, and there is a price in it that neither of you has understood. The moon law did not bind you by chance, and it does not bind to punish. It binds true mates whom pride has tried to part, and it binds them so that they cannot survive apart, precisely so that they cannot repeat the error a second time. The bond between you is no longer half a thing, children. It has rooted, and a rooted mate bond, denied, does not fade. It kills. You will not last another week at the far ends of a hall. You have exactly 2 roads left, and only 2. She looked from one of them to the other. Complete the bond and be saved together, or refuse it and die together. There is no third door, and the year is already a fifth of the way spent. For a long while, no one spoke. The fire ticked. Outside, the moon, 3 nights from full, climbed the cold sky. Then Dryston said, to the floor in the flat, dead voice of a man laying down a weight he has carried too long to remember life without it, her name was Selah. Orla went still. Marin did not move, afraid that any sound would close him again. "My father was a great alpha and a colder man than the winter," he said. "On the night he died and passed me the crown, he passed me one thing more. A prophecy his own mother had spoken over his cradle and his over mine, going back further than anyone living can count. That the moon would one day mark the true mate of the Calder Moon Alpha, and that she would be the ruin of everything he had sworn to protect. My father refused his fated mate on the strength of it. Built the whole iron strength of this pack on that refusal. On the lesson that an alpha who loves has handed his enemies the knife. He told me to do the same when my turn came. To reject the moon when it came for me, and feel nothing, and be safe." His mouth twisted. "I told him I would never be the man he was, I was young, and I meant it. Selah, Marin said softly, a healer's apprentice, low-born, like you. Gentle like you, and far too brave for her own safety like you, and the moon marked her for mine, when we were barely more than children. His eyes had gone somewhere far away, and full of grief. I did not reject her. I defied my father, and the prophecy, and the whole snickering court, and I meant to claim her in the open and let them choke on it. We used to meet at the old water shrine below the keep, where no one of rank would lower themselves to go. She was not afraid of me, even then. She used to say the prophecy was a story old men told to excuse themselves for being cold, and that she intended to ruin nothing but my reputation, and only a little, and only because I had earned it. His voice cracked and he pressed on through it, and before the bond could be sealed, before I could put my mark on her, and make her truly mine and truly safe, she was dead. An accident, they told me. A fall on a dark stair in a wing of the keep she had no reason to be in, on the one night I was kept late in council by a matter that turned out to be nothing at all. The prophecy come true, they whispered. The low girl who would have ruined him, removed by the mercy of the moon. His hands had curled into fists. I believed it. I was young and grief makes you stupid, and they told the story so kindly, so patiently, until I could not tell their voices from my own. For a year now, since my father's death woke the worst of it, I have believed that loving her killed her, that the moon itself struck her down to save the pack from my weakness, and that every soul lost in the grief of it waits for me in that fog to remind me, night after night, what my heart cost the people foolish enough to hold it. That is the pale between. It is not a curse laid by an enemy with a staff and a chant. It is the one I have been laying on myself, every night, for a year, because some part of me has always believed I deserved it. The understanding broke over Marin all at once, and it ached in her chest like a bruise pressed deep. He had not thrown her off the terrace because she was beneath him. He had thrown her off to save her life. Every cruel word had been a man trying, in the only clumsy way grief had left him, to keep the moon from killing a second girl he could not help but want. Dry Stan. She reached across the small space and took his fisted hand in both of hers, and slowly, finger by finger, she opened it. Listen to me, a gentle girl did not ruin a kingdom by being loved. Stairs do not happen to be dark. On the one night, a low-born mate climbs them. You were handed a story, by the very people who profited from her death, and you have spent a year, letting it eat you alive, in the dark. The prophecy did not kill Selah. Someone did. And I think if we are brave enough to walk into that fog and look, we will find it has been wearing a borrowed face this whole time. He stared at her, as though she had pulled the floor out from under a year of his life. If you are right, then you were never cursed to destroy what you love, Marin said. You were only lied to, by people who needed you afraid. And I am done watching it work. She held his gaze, and her own voice gentled because the next part she had never said aloud to anyone. I know something about a story that eats you in the dark, she said. They left me on the shrine steps in a basket the night I was born, and for most of my life, I was certain it was because there was something wrong with me. That, if I had been quieter, or prettier, or more useful, or simply more, they would have kept me. I made myself small enough to slip through any room without being seen, and I called it humility, and it was really just a child still trying to deserve being wanted. Her thumb moved over his scarred knuckles. It took me a long time to understand that being abandoned said everything about them and nothing at all about me. Selah's death is the same lie, Dryston, only crueler, because someone built it on purpose and handed it to you to carry. You did not cost her her life by loving her. You were robbed, and then taught to thank the thief. For a moment he could not speak at all. When he did, his voice had gone rough as broken stone. How is it, he said, that the one person in this realm everyone agreed was no one, is the only one who has ever once told me the truth? It could still take you, he said, then hoarsely, if you choose this, if you choose me. The bond, the between, all of it. I cannot promise you it will not cost you everything. You have spent a year deciding what things will cost me, without once asking what I am willing to pay. Marin lifted his hand and pressed her lips to his scarred knuckles, and felt him shudder. So I will tell you plainly, husband, and you will listen, for once. I choose you. Not the law, not the moon, not the crown, you. The tired man who leaves a candle burning and a cup of milk on the sill and pretends he does not. I would rather die bonded to him in 3 nights than live a clean, safe, lonely life, having let him go into the dark alone. Now stop protecting me from my own heart, and let me in. For a moment he did not move. Then something in him that had been clenched shut for a year simply let go. He cupped her face in both his hands as though she were the only solid thing in a sinking world, and he kissed her, and it was nothing like the cold of the terrace. It was a year of held breath let out at once. Orla, with the discretion of the very old, took her staff and her clouded eyes, and was gone before the kiss had ended. He gathered her up from the narrow cot, as though she weighed nothing at all, and carried her out of the infirmary, and up through the sleeping heap to his own chambers, and neither of them spoke a word the whole way, because some things do not need them. What passed between them after, in the deep hush of his rooms, and the low light of a banked fire, was tender and unhurried, and long overdue. 2 people who had been refused each other learning at last that they need not be. When the moment came that the bond drew tight and asked to be sealed, Marin did not flinch from it. She felt his mark settle over her racing heart, warm and golden and complete, and she set her own claim on him in answer, and the silver band on her wrist flared bright as the full moon and ran up her arm in threads of living light, and the cold law that had chained 2 strangers together remade itself, in a single bright instant, into the thing it had always been meant to become, a true bond. Chosen, sealed, he fell asleep with her gathered against his chest, and his face in her hair, and for the first time in a year the dark did not come for him. No fever, no shaking, no fog rising at the edges of the room, only her husband, breathing slow and deep and easy, his heart steady under her cheek, his arm holding her as though he had finally been given leave to. Joy rose in her so fierce it stung her eyes. She had done this. She had given him this. The year ahead, which had stretched out like a road into the dark, suddenly had light at the far end of it. She lay awake a while in the hush, unwilling to waste a moment of it on sleep, watching the moon through the high window. It still wanted 3 nights to come to full, fat and white and patient over the peaks, the same moon that had marked them and bound them and very nearly killed them, and for the first time she did not resent it. Only once did a cold thought brush her, the memory of Vesna in the gallery with her lovely lethal smile, and the warning beneath it that a year held a great many nights, and a patient house could find a use for any one of them. But the man breathing slow against her was warm and whole, and hers, and the bond between them sang low and golden and complete, and Marin told herself that whatever the houses were sharpening, they would face it together now, 2 and not 1, and there was nothing in the waking world she feared so long as she could reach him. It was not the waking world she should have feared. Marin closed her eyes and let the warmth pull her down into sleep. And in the black heart of the night, the bond went tight as a drawn bowstring, and tighter, and then it wrenched, and the warm weight of him was simply torn away from her. She came awake with a cry into cold and silver. The bed was gone. The keep was gone. The pale trees stood close around her under the swollen wrong moon, and the mist breathed between them. And somewhere ahead in the white her husband was screaming a name she now knew, and this time, when the cold light rose around her, it did not let her go. The pale between was not a dream, and had never been one. Marin understood it the moment the cold silver closed over her, and did not let go. A dream releases you. This place held. The mist was not weather. It moved with intent, pressing against her skin like cold hands, parting to let her through, and sealing shut behind her, herding her deeper into the white. The bone-pale trees leaned in to watch her pass. The ground gave underfoot like something living. And the silence was not empty at all. It was crowded, dense with held breath and old grief. The hush of a room in the instant before something unforgivable is said. She followed the bond, like a thread through the dark, and it led her to a clearing where the fog thinned, and what she found there stopped her where she stood. Dryston knelt, in the soft wrong ground, head down, his open hands hanging empty at his sides, and he was diminished in a way that frightened her more than any monster could have. The king who filled every hall he entered, the wolf that grown warriors stepped aside for in the corridors, had been stripped here of all his armor, and what remained was only a man being crushed slowly beneath a weight she could not see. Around the edge of the clearing stood the dead, not beast people. Soldiers and villagers and wolves in human shape, their faces worn featureless by a year of his grief, ranged in a great patient ring, and they were murmuring without pause. The same few words turned and turned like stones in a current, and every word was an accusation, and every accusation came in his own voice. Dryston, she crossed to him and dropped to her knees, and took his face in her hands the way she had that first night on the cold floor. I am here. Look at me. I followed you in. I will not leave you to this. His eyes found hers, dull and drowning. You should not have come, he said. This is mine to carry. They are right. Listen to them. They are right. They are you. Marin said. Every voice in this fog is yours, husband. This is not a curse some witch spat at you. It is a year of you agreeing with a lie. And then the murmuring stopped. Out of the white at the front of the crowd, one small shape took a single step forward, and Marin felt Dryston go rigid beneath her hands. The figure came into the thin light, and she was young and gentle-faced, and there was a stillness about her that the living never carry, a pallor like moonlight lying on snow, and Marin knew her without being told. Selah, Dryston breathed, and the name broke in half coming out of him. The ghost looked at him with sorrow, and when she spoke, her voice was soft and kind, which made the words infinitely worse. You did this, she said. You loved me, and loving you is what put me on that stair. A wiser Alpha would have let me go. You knew the prophecy, and you kept me anyway, and so you killed me as surely as if your own hand had done it. Their blood is your blood. All of it. You have always known. Marin felt the words land in Dryston, felt them through the bond, like a blade going in, and she watched him begin to bow under them, watched his head start to drop in agreement, the way it must have dropped through all the long nights before this one. So she did the only thing she could think to do. She let go of him, and she rose, and she stepped between her husband and the ghost of the girl he had failed to save. No, Marin said. She would never have said that to you. That is not her voice, it is yours, dressed in her face, and I think she has been trying to get a word past it for a very long time. She looked at the ghost, at the gentle ruined girl, and she spoke to her not as a horror, but as a person. Selah. You do not have to say the thing he needs to hear in order to keep hurting himself. You can tell him what truly happened. I think you have been waiting for someone to ask. For a long moment nothing moved in all that white. Then the darkness fell out of the ghost's eyes, the borrowed cruelty draining away like dye from cloth, and what stood there at last was simply a frightened girl who had died too young and far too surprised. When Selah spoke again, her voice was her own. I did not fall, she said. Dryston lifted his head. It was dark on the stair, and I had been told to wait there, by a servant I trusted, with a message that you wished to meet me away from the court. The ghost pressed a hand to her own heart, as though it still remembered. There was a hand at my back. I turned, and I saw the face above me before I went down, and it wore the silver hawk of House Aldermere. The old lord himself, Rurik, who had told his daughters at supper that no shrine-bred girl would ever wear the Caldermoon crown while his house drew breath. She looked at Dryston with terrible tenderness. It was never the moon, Dryston. It was never your love. A man pushed me down a stair to keep his line near a throne, and then men, kinder than him, taught you to call it fate, so that you would never come looking for the truth. I have been screaming it at you in this place for a year. You could not hear it over how much you wished to be guilty. The grief that came out of Dryston then was not the quiet agreement of the past year. It was a wound finally lanced, a year of poison pouring out at once, and he wept the way the very strong weep when they break, with his whole body, and Marin went down to her knees and gathered him against her and held on. "Let it go," she said into his hair, and she did not mean the grief, because grief is not a thing a person should be asked to set down. Let the guilt go, not her, never her. Keep her and grieve her and say her name as often as you like. But put down the lie that you killed her. It was not yours to carry. It never was. "I am so sorry," Dristan said, not to Marin, but to the girl in the fog. "I am sorry I believed them. I am sorry I let you stand here a year, telling the truth to a man too broken to hear it." Selah smiled, and it was the smile of someone finally allowed to rest. "Then hear it now," she said, "and go and live, both of you. The dead do not need your suffering. We only ever needed to be remembered honestly." The fog began to thin. One by one, the figures at the clearing's edge turned and walked back into the white and were unmade, gently, like breath on a cold morning, their long murmuring quiet. At last, Selah was the final one. She looked at Marin before she went, and there was no jealousy in it, only a kind of fierce gratitude. Then she closed her eyes, and she was gone, and the pale between dissolved around them like frost under a climbing sun. For a moment they knelt alone in the last of the white, the fog unraveling into clean, cold air, the unbearable weight of the place simply gone. Drystan lifted his head and looked around the emptying clearing as though seeing it for the first time without a crowd of the dead at its edges. And Marin watched a year of dread lift off his shoulders, watched him become, by degrees, the size he was meant to be. "It is quiet," he said wonderingly. "I had forgotten quiet. I have not stood anywhere quiet in a year." He turned to her, and there was wet on his face and something unguarded and astonished underneath it. "You walked into the worst thing I have, and you did not flinch, and you pulled the truth out of it with your bare hands. I do not know what the moon was thinking when it chose me, but I begin to understand what it was thinking when it chose you." Marin woke in the great bed, with the gray dawn at the windows and her husband alive and shaking in her arms, weeping still but breathing, whole, free. She held him until the worst of it passed, and then she held him a while longer because some things should not be hurried. He claimed her 3 days later, on the full moon before the entire pack. He summoned them to the same high terrace of Stony Reach where he had thrown her back, and the whole of Caldermoon climbed to watch, the great houses among them, Vesna of Aldermere in the front rank, with a careful smile that did not reach her eyes, for she had spent 3 days hearing rumors she did not like. Drystan stood at the head of the terrace, with Marin's hand in his, and Halvard at his shoulder, with a sheaf of testimony 3 days in the gathering, the confession of a frightened old servant chief among it, and Drystan told his pack the truth. All of it. The prophecy his house had hidden behind for generations. The murder of a healer's girl, years before, ordered by Rurik Aldermere to keep his blood near a crown. The plot to do the same again, to a second shrine-bred mate, dressed up before the moon court as Mercy. By the time he finished, no one in House Aldermere was smiling. Rurik tried to speak, and found no one would meet his eye. Vesna tried to flee, and found Hovard's guards already at the stair. The house that had bought its place at the throne with 2 murders and a lie was stripped of its honors before the moon had cleared the peaks, and led down off the terrace into a future a great deal smaller than the one Vesna had promised herself. Then Drystan turned to Marin, and he raised her hand, and he spoke so that every soul on that terrace would carry it home. "A year ago, I stood on this stone," he said, "and told you, I would not take a foundling off the shrine steps as Luna of this pack. I was a coward, and I was lied to, and I was wrong, so hear me correct it. There is no woman of any blood in this realm, or any other I would set above her. The moon did not make a mistake. I did, and I have spent the years since learning the difference. He looked at her and the whole pack fell away, and there was only the tired man who had hidden every gentleness he owned behind a cold face for a year, and been found out anyway. Be my Luna, Marin, not because a law binds you to it, because I am asking. And Marin, shrine girl, foundling, no one, looked out at the pack that had drawn back from her in this same silver light a year before, and then up at the man who had refused her here, and crossed a year of dark to come back and choose her in the open. The fog did not vanish from him all at once, and Marin never expected it to. Some nights he still woke, with Sayla's name on his lips, and the old grief sitting on his chest, and on those nights, Marin did not try to chase it off or talk him out of it. She lit the candle, and she put her hand over his heart, and she let him remember out loud, for as long as he needed, because she had learned at the shrine that the dead are kept alive by being spoken of, and that there is a great difference between a wound and a scar. Slowly over the turning seasons, the difference grew in him. The nights he woke became fewer. The weight he woke under grew lighter. He learned, with a clumsiness that broke her heart and then mended it, how to grieve a thing without being devoured by it. The pack came around more quickly than either of them expected, though that was less forgiveness than self-interest, for a king who sleeps, and a Luna who keeps him whole, are worth more to a people than the finest blood in the realm. There were still whispers. Marin found she no longer heard them. She had spent a lifetime making herself small enough to slip through any room unseen, and somewhere in that long, hard year, she had simply set the habit down, the way Dristan had set down his, and forgotten where she had left it. When the year was spent at last, and the moon law came to judge what they had made of it, the silver mark on her wrist did not fade as the law allowed. It deepened and warmed and settled into her skin for good, the binding remade by their own choosing into the bond it had always meant to become. The moon, it seemed, was satisfied. They climbed the terrace together on the night it ended, to the same cold stone under the same white moon, and this time no one was watching, and no one needed to be. Marin leaned into her husband's side, and his arm came around her without hesitation, and the wind off the peaks was sharp and clean and smelled of nothing worse than coming snow. "Any regrets, Your Majesty?" she asked, "now that the law would let you go?" Dristan considered her in the moonlight, the shrine girl the moon had chosen, and he had been fool enough to refuse, and the corner of his mouth lifted in the small, private way that still felt like a gift she had earned. "Only that I made us both wait a year," he said, "to learn what the moon knew in a heartbeat." He drew her closer, and they stood a while longer, in the cold, bright dark, in no hurry now, with all the time in the world. And then they went in, together, and they slept.